En 3, 2.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me along today. It's fantastic to be here with alongside such an esteemed lineup. I'm going to be speaking through a paper that was published last year by Commonwealth Thinktank, which is where I work. We're a think tank working on ownership strategies for a democratic and sustainable economy. And we published the paper alongside the Democracy Collaborative, who are a think tank working based in DC. And what I'll be speaking about is the need to democratise knowledge, particularly looking at IP and R&D in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what is our case for action? Well, firstly, COVID-19 has demonstrated deep systemic fault lines in our approach to intellectual property and research and development. And these fault lines have deepened injustices and inequalities. It has imperiled the lives and the health, the safety, the livelihoods of so many, particularly in low and middle income countries. And consistent efforts towards the creation of a global patent pool for various COVID-19 vaccines, particularly voices coming from poorer nations, locked out of adequate supplies to the vaccines, have been quashed. Now, the decision by pharmaceutical giants to hand a handful, and alongside a handful of wealthy nations in particular, to prioritise corporate profits and an exclusionary version of intellectual property rights to the vaccines is proven not only to be deadly, but to dramatically deepen economic, geographical and social power imbalances. This is a deadly and short-sighted decision, and it is emblematic of the systemic failures embedded into the design and operations of our approach to intellectual property and research and development. Now, it's important to understand the recent developments around restricted access to vaccines in the broader context of intellectual property increasingly becoming a driving force for the accumulation and protection of assets by a narrow set of large multinational corporations and elite interests. But while the protection of IP is hailed as a means of generating innovation, current approaches to this has resulted in outcomes such as sluggish rates to innovation, increasing economic and racial inequity, and reductions in competition. Similarly, research and development has increasingly been directed towards private interests and private profits in recent years, and allowing IP and R&D to primarily benefit private interests and corporations were failing to equitably develop and distribute products and services to adequately compensate workers and taxpayers and minimise, and we're minimising the stimulation of innovation. And this is an incredibly powerful tool if harnessed effectively to address the intensifying and intersecting crises that we face today. So in our paper, we set out a new approach which looks at reforming IP and R&D in the UK and the US. And this approach looks to the conceptualization, design and implementation of IP and R&D to one that recognises how critical these interconnected and entwined systems are to building a more equitable, sustainable and democratic 21st century economy. Firstly, we set out a series of principles. So this is in the context of extending and enhancing democratic public ownership and control in the 21st century economy. The first of these principles is in reversing the encroachment and expanding the public commons. It's imperative that we halt and begin to reverse the process of privatisation and encroachment and build and rebuild a public knowledge commons with fairer access as one of its core fundamental principles. In general, we believe that democratic public ownership principles are rooted in decentralisation, participation, multi-stakeholder representation, and they can and should be integrated into the management of public approaches to IP in various ways. The second principle is the need to increase public R&D and ensure public benefit for all. Increasing public funding and support for R&D is critical given the many intersecting ecological, social and economic crises we face today. Importantly, we think that public funding and support plays a role in the development of new technologies, products and concepts. Given this, we think the public should appropriately benefit from this, for example, through ownership rights. The third principle is that of global solidarity and reparations to both address the harms caused by historical injustices and confront global structural imbalances designed into today's economy. Processes of international reparations, technological transfers, and solidarity must be absolutely central to the agenda of IP and R&D. Fourth is the principle of challenging corporations and monopoly power. The increased scope and scale of IP protections, the use and abuse of defensive patents, and the exploitation of publicly funded research and development to bolster corporate profits has the effect of, for example, decreasing instances of competition. It has increased rent-seeking behaviour. It's weakened public control, transparency, and democratic accountability. The final principle is that of workers' rights and empowerment. IP and R&D should enhance, not weaken, workers' rights and empowerment. This needs to include an enhancement of worker representation and voice, and the removal of IP rights and protections from companies that use them to avoid labour protections and abuse workers. Now, in order to see these principles embedded, we recommended a series of policy proposals that can guide a new approach to R&D and IP in the US and UK. The first of those is significantly increasing public R&D investment to around 2% of GDP or more over the next 10 years. Now, how we do this matters, and where that money is channeled to matters. We need to do this in a way that promotes equity, sustainability, and democracy, which means, among other things, overhauling our tax systems. It means the establishment of new institutions to complement this approach, like the creation of public investment banks, the development of a broader industrial strategy that focuses on securing ecological sustainability, on nurturing alternative models of ownership, and reducing corporate concentration and power. Second, we call for a need to ensure that intellectual property serves the public good with a mission-oriented and common ownership approach. For example, we should link the granting of continuation of IP protections as well as public R&D investments to certain public goods. This could look like tax justice, population health, equitable access to vaccines and medicines, and workers' rights. Third, we need to grow the public stake in the creations of the mind through the development of publicly owned and democratically governed IP commons entities, shifting us from an innovation system based on enclosure and competition to one that centres principles of cooperation and greater pooling and sharing of risks and rewards. So, for example, this could look like requiring the IP generated from publicly funded R&D be put into the commons, either immediately or after a short period of exclusivity. This could also look like requiring that IP is revoked from or denied to private corporations due to labour abuses or public good abuses, and that these are put into the public commons. Fourth, we need to reorient the role of the state away from simply correcting market defects and proactively shaping and determining output and innovation that is of public interest. Now, one of the ways that we could do this is through the creation of a publicly funded and managed venture capital fund to invest and manage shares in private firms that can support this. Next, and this is pretty central to what we've seen throughout the pandemic, and as we've navigated the pandemic, what's become increasingly clear is the power and control demonstrated by pharmaceutical companies. Publicly owned pharmaceutical and manufacturing entities in the UK and US can not only control the cost of drugs domestically, but can safeguard affordable medicines globally through technological transfers and open access to medical and pharmaceutical research. Lastly, we need genuine international cooperation based on solidarity and reparations for centuries of extraction and exploitation. This should involve, but obviously not be limited to, removing IP restrictions on certain critical innovations and overhauling the pro-corporate, pro-enclosure IP rules and systems that have predominated the international free trade agreements and institutions to support economic development, ecological sustainability, public health, self-determination, and poverty alleviation in the global south. As a starting point, and just now, it has never been more evident for the need for wealthy nations like the UK to back compulsory sharing of intellectual property, data, and know-how related to medical medicines and vaccines, particularly during a public health emergency. IP and R&D systems and approaches are critical to the functioning of any economic system. And despite decades of privatization and enclosure and corporate capture, they are still largely within our ability to reimagine and redesign them. And we have the power to do that, and we need to use it, because the last year has demonstrated these deep fault lines that have been designed into the operations of intellectual property and research and development. By applying principles of democratic public ownership and control, we can and should turn these systems into engines that power equitable, democratic, and sustainable 21st century economy. Thank you.
Okay, Miriam, we have not questions in the chat, so you can close it now if you want.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.